Buenos días, damas y caballeros.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Latin American Organization of Energy and the Ministry of Industry and Energy and Mining of Uruguay, the IDB, and the First Investment Forum of IRENA, we welcome you all to this 18th week of energy. It's an honor for the organizing institutions to host this event and to meet on this occasion in the city of Montevideo. We want to express our gratitude to our sponsors and for the support of our institutions. The Energy Week and the first Energy Latin American Forum in this session called New Generation Energies. We would like to invite our moderator who will be leading this very important session. Her name is Jone Orbea. Jone is the leader of the MOVE program, Electric Mobility in Latin America and the Caribbean at the UNEP office for Latin America and the Caribbean. Jone is an economist with a master's degree in international economics and development from the Complutense University of Madrid and has been working on urban transport and mobility for more than 10 years. The last 5 years specifically on transport electrification in Latin America and the Caribbean. Previously, she worked in this sector on issues related to industry analysis and macroeconomic development, as well as the promotion of sustainability in cities. We will give now the floor to Jone Orbea. Thank you very much, Pablo. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Olade, for the invitation. Today we have, as you can see, a very rich panel in this session that will be talking about these technologies, new generation technologies, new generation energy. And before we start with our questions and before asking the panelists to share their views, I think there are some topics that have been mentioned in the opening sessions that we have just attended, and these are very relevant for our topic that we will be discussing today. First of all, as the Minister Paganini said, we are in a change of paradigm at this moment. Technology and these new energies are part of allowing this change in the paradigm, which will be giving us this option of change towards decarbonization, not only in the energy sector, but of the economy in general. As the General Secretary of Olade said, many mentions have been made to that transition or that change to follow a logic of inclusive change, of equity and inclusion. That is very important because we don't separate technology from this, an electrolyzer, a wind ventilator, of what's happening on the ground, of the people who are benefited and impacted with this. Another element, which is very important and has repeated in other sessions like the energy transition, is very important regarding international relations and will be even more important from now on. And how we see ourselves in the future, what technologies will we implement in the future, and how these will be coordinated in this energy transition. This will be very important to see how the countries are seen in the world, how the world is seen, and finally, regarding this, the private sector, the great importance of the private sector, how we can not only have public policies, of course, it's very important to have these, but it's also very important to have private companies that have the technology
Todas las tecnologías que se pueden aprovechar en esta región, que ya se están aprovechando, cómo las podemos impulsar para que sean la base de.
So this is the basis of our transition through transition mechanisms to aim at those companies those private companies that want to foster or want to grow in the business in this region can have this security. And finally, what Enrique Iglesias was saying, these new times of energy transition, of the international relations, and how all of this can lead Latin America to have a new position, a green positioning, a leadership position in this energy transition. So with this great panel that we have with us today, we can start our discussions. I've prepared some questions. I changed them a little bit from the original ones, and I would like to start with Silvio Binato. Can share a general overview of energy, of new generation energy in Latin America. And my question is, what's the current situation of new generation energies in Latin America? And what do you think are the emerging technologies that are most promising? Which ones do you believe will grow the most in the region and help in this transition with equity and inclusion? Thank you very much. Thank you, Olade, for the invitation. It's a very important question, especially here in Latin America. As we saw, we are in a part of the world which is it has a big link with renewable energy. In Latin America, we always had a hydroelectric share, which was very important in the energy sector. Our grid is we are starting after 10 years a transition with a renewable energy, especially solar, photovoltaic, and wind energy. And in the future, we will be having a lot of space for new energies, for new technology. The most important that I see, we are even developing a consultancy because we're looking at the future of 18 countries in Latin America, all the countries of South America, and most of the countries of Central America, and also 3 countries from the Caribbean. We are developing a vision of decarbonization by 2050, and the main players in the long term that we are seeing are wind energy and green hydrogen also will have a very important share in some countries. There's an intention on the part of the countries to develop the green hydrogen for decarbonization. Thank you. Very well. We can see that this vision of the future, we have wind, offshore, and green hydrogen. Thank you very much, Silvio. Yes, this is in the long term, exactly. And regarding wind energy, I would like to ask Ramon and Andres, because they come from companies that have wind energy. Do you believe that this will be the future? What's the current situation of wind energy in the region? What's the future? What are the challenges that you see for that increase in wind energy? And what are the big opportunities? What countries, what regions, what characteristics do you believe you will have?
Quizá porque englobo a Andrés y algún otro más, me toca abrir.
Okay, that is a very, very important question. And you include everything in that question, by the way. Every year in Latin America, and this started like 10 years ago, we have like 5 gigabytes of wind energy onshore. And if to that you add a constant increase of photovoltaic increase, then we can say that in the last 5 years, 10 gigabytes every year are coming from renewable energy in the energy mix in Latin America. This is an unstoppable trend in the sense that in most of the countries in Latin America, we have implemented decarbonization programs basically focused on energy transition, as Silvio was saying, for the long term. But the long term starts right away. It's not that we're going to wait till 2050 to start with the process, right? So the process starts right here, right now. Unfortunately, and thanks to technology, we can now open markets basically because of competition reasons. Because this kind of energy is showing that in these electric systems and how reliable they are. So there's no doubt then that the future of these technologies is very important. It is very clear that they will be replacing combustion energies and will be complementary with renewable conventional energies. And also that from the standpoint of new projects, including offshore technologies, the future of Latin America is very promising. At least there are 4 countries that have adopted energy policies that are market-oriented, trying to open this market to these technologies. I'm talking about Colombia, Brazil, Costa Rica, also Panama. It's starting with this. Uruguay is about to. So there's a clearly an intention of analyzing the possibilities and potential of this technology so it can be introduced in the energy mix. Also from the technology perspective, this can replace hydroelectric. Because of the size of these wind marine projects and the amount of energy that they are working with, where these projects are being analyzed, are showing in a way that we are talking about a type of power and installations that are never below 500 kilowatts. And we can think about 4 megabytes, especially in the largest markets. So in that sense, we can consider this a complement for hydroelectric energy if, because of climate reasons, are not producing the results expected. And if you asked about barriers, well, there are many. For some years, the most significant barrier for this kind of technology was basically the lack of political will or the lack of ambition to identify specific objectives for electric systems and trying to define some portions of the mix so that we can use renewable energies. What happens today is that that some countries are aligned with the decarbonization objectives that are fully connected to the increase in the consumption of renewable energies. Now we have a more important problem. That is basically, it's not about lack of political will, but the thing is that there are barriers to the implementation of the project, and this has to do with the increase of capacity of the grid, or having a vision of energy transition that should be in the long term and not in the short term. We need to plan a system that can implement the changes planned in the future. I'm talking about social acceptance issues in the sense that there are a lot of administrative barriers for the implementation of these projects that, in a way, are undermining the investment environment. There are disappointing expectations of communities that are really willing to make profit of all these projects, to have new possibilities. And basically, then these projects are not making any kind of progress. And there are many, many reasons for that to happen. But basically, the responsibility is not of the companies, but of the government. And I will stop here because well, in my case, I would like to add what Ramon said about technologies. Wind technologies in Latin America, this kind of energy has shown its capacity. So there's nothing new with wind farms in the region. And when it comes to interconnectivity and storage, we are seeing some reactions because we are not being able to use all that energy, or because we cannot comply with the requirements of the demand. As Ramon said, there are several reasons. We have a natural limit for the growth of these renewable sources so that we can decarbonize economies. We can talk about electric mobility as one of the most important factors of growth, but we need those electric networks or storage systems that will allow us to use those electric networks in a more efficient way. And that is another vector that is important to take into account, that is part of a technology that we need to include in the agenda. And also something else about the fair transition process, just to add to what Ramon said. We believe that wind energy in these years in Latin America, and each country with its own regulations, they were able to make progress. And in all cases, we are seeing wind farms or projects that are taking communities into account. These are projects with extensive processes, working together with communities, with the cities or towns nearby, and they are integrated to this economic system. And that is a plus factor that we have in this fair transition. And wind energy has been able to develop these cases. In the case of Brazil, probably is the most significant one, where we have all the industry included, and they probably started 15 years ago. And today, at least in our case, we see that factories in Brazil are competitive worldwide. They can satisfy the local demand, but also they are able to sell those products abroad. Also, we need to take into account that a wind plant can work for many, many years. That allows us to train local people, to include the communities, to train professionals and offer high quality jobs for many years. If we add to that the capacity to develop suppliers for repair work, for different kind of jobs as it happens in Europe and in the States, that little by little makes of this sector not only an energy sector, but also there has a huge social and industrial component that can allow us to develop local economies. That is what we need in the region. This fair transition basically wants to include as many stakeholders as possible, so that we have an energy that is free of emissions, and it also includes the community in the project. And that is, I think, what I wanted to say to complement my colleague's contribution. Thank you very much for your comments. And you both mentioned distribution networks. They're going to be talking about that, but just remember those terms because we can expand on that later. So the next question is for Agustin. Agustin he works in biofuels, so my question is connected about the role of biofuels in this energy transition, where we have different generation methods, but also other aspects included in the use of that energy that is generated, and which consumption sectors of fossil fuels would be replaced thanks to biofuels. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. And let me quote Ramon when he said that the long term starts today. That is something very important in a energy transition context when experts on climate change are warning us that we have a limit of 14 years to dramatically change the trajectory of emissions, and by doing that avoid that increase of 1.5 Celsius degrees as part of the agreements on climate change, and apparently we are running behind. Within that context, and talking about the transportation sector, as John said at the beginning of the presentation of this panel, there are many paradigms, new paradigms that are appearing. Probably the strongest is electromobility, and what we are saying is that paradigm is growing in different ways at different paces in different countries, and we see many countries that are going behind. That happens in Latin America. I saw the sales data of electric vehicles in Latin America for 2022 is around 1%. So in that framework of energy transition that is moving forwards too slow, biofuels, without representing a paradigm change, because basically bioethanol is a fuel that can be combined with gasoline or naphtha as we call it, and today they can be used for decarbonization of 70–80% compared to fossil fuels. I think that the most significant example would be Brazil, that is replacing 50% of its gasoline with ethanol. But there are in the world 70 countries that are using bioethanol or biodiesel, and in Latin America and the Caribbean we have 13 countries that are using biodiesel or bioethanol, and they have very interesting certifications. They are free of deforestation processes. They show a great reduction in the production of GHGs. Within that framework, then, if you check the last report by net zero emissions of the International Energy Agency, it says that the production of biofuels in this transition has to be multiplied by 3 by 2040. And I could say that by 2040, land transportation, diesel and gas oil represent more than 70% of the emission of the transportation sector. There is an important role to play. And if you want to consider the mid and the long term, it is, I think, very relevant to talk about aviation biofuels here, sustainable aviation fuels, SAF, in a context where industrial aviation has committed to being net zero by 2050. For that, they are applying a package of measures, differences in infrastructure, and the 50% of the sector will be the result of this SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. And that represents a huge challenge because the largest production of SAFs, that is aviation biofuels, most of those SAFs are going to be for the aviation sector, and the challenge that we are facing is that we need to create an industry or 449 cubic meters, and this is 3 times the industry of land biofuels today. And that is the kind of industry that we need to create to decarbonize the air sector so that it is net zero emissions. So I could split that into the mid and the short term. Mid and long term for aviation biofuels, it is going to be a great solution because electric mobility won't be able. In air transportation, hydrogen is expected to represent 1.5 of the aviation mobility by 2050. With all this, then, all we have is the sustainable aviation fuels. Thank you very much, Agustin. I think that now we have a vision of how different technologies can complement each other. This is not a competence, or it's not supposed to be a technology competence. We need to reach net zero by 2050, so we don't go over the 1.5 Celsius degrees, and apparently we're not going in the right direction. So I think that we need to see how these technologies can complement each other so that we can provide support to different industries and the countries in the decarbonization process. And as part of the Argentinian and Uruguayan governments, Florencia and Wilson, the question to use is, what is this energy mix, or the projections for these different renewable energies or different uses that will allow Argentina and Uruguay to follow this decarbonization path? So maybe Florencia? Okay, first of all, I would like to thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think that Argentina is facing challenges as a very large country. We have an energy mix that is varied. Today we have 50% renewable. If we include hydroelectric, we have nuclear energy. Of course, we have thermal energy, and we have a huge potential for development in Vaca Muerta. And we are working very hard to extend the pipelines. And I think that talking about Argentina and the region is basically to believe that we have a huge development potential that is just waiting for us. When we talk about wind energy, solar energy, and trying to work with these environmental issues, I had the opportunity of visiting the factory in Florencio Varela, and it's really impressive to see those huge windmills on land. Those are huge. And I think that it's essential to know that we are facing a challenge when it comes to transmission networks, and also in implementing smart networks, to include the smart grid as a long-term policy. That's why I believe that when our energy secretary started working last year, the first activity that she implemented basically was to implementing our energy transition plan. It was focused on fair and affordable transition, a sustainable transition. In that sense, we have faced several challenges. We had organized a call for tender to try to include to our mix 610 mega, and we have received offers for 2,000 megas. We have also having another bid to replace fossil fuels being used, aiming to include gas as source for our main axis. In that transition, we called for 3,000 megas, and we got offers for more than 7,000 megas. So we have a huge potential in Argentina for the private sector that is interested in energy and interested in investing, not only about generation, but basically about demand that is constantly required to include this transmission grid. That's why the Energy Secretariat, among all those challenges that we are facing, we design a master plan for transmission grid together with the private sector and the Federal Commission of Energy that is providing advice to the Energy Secretariat. We created the master plan for these transmission lines. Not only that, we make progress in investment. We included more than 820 kilometers of high tension lines. We do have a potential, but we need to be able to distribute that potential. We need to use those Patagonic winds and create energy for the rest of the country. We have looked for new challenges. Not long ago, we wanted to have some developments in the northern area with 2,500 mega of distributed energy, and we want to strengthen the system And to do that, we want to include the private sector. Then this distributed generation, that is a huge challenge for distributors and also for us as part of the national governments. As a federal country, it is different for us who is operating which jurisdiction. That's why the idea in Argentina at the Energy Secretariat is to work together with distribution grids, with the transportation network, so that we can provide solutions to demand, including new generation. Energy generation through which we try to understand the potential of the country, and we are part of the lithium triangle together with Chile and Bolivia. We are committed to generating new job opportunities using Argentinian resources and in the region, thanks to storage. In this last bid, we have included that challenge when trying to replace forced generation, including storage. And it is through all these strategies. I remember that on October 11th, we finished the process so that the public and private sector can co-finance transmission networks. We have got offers from 10 different companies. That is something new for Argentina. We hope this to open the doors so that this is a beacon and it shall represent what can be done together with the public and the private sector. Apart from biofuels, as my colleagues mentioned, when we talk in Argentina, we mention sustainable mobility, basically focusing on the resources that we have, those resources that we can exploit. There are some provinces, as Córdoba, for instance, they have migration program for the public fleet for the use of biofuels, using the resources in the province so that they can exploit the potential of each of the regions. So that's why I think that today the largest challenge that we are facing is to coordinate a relationship between the public and the private sector that goes beyond current work, so that we can have clear rules for the private sector, which the aims are, and through that we can have gas investment, including the Nestor Kirchner pipeline, including the northern pipeline also, where we are changing our energy grid, but with the main aim that is to have a strong country. A country in which energy generation is a sustainable market, a market to include security to our networks. So I just wanted to mention that 2 weeks ago we had the Smart Grid Forum, and we have included in the agenda a topic that was pending in our country, basically in which direction we are moving with our networks to commit to including smart grids. I know about the Uruguayan case that you have 1 million smart meters. We would like to have something like that in our country, of course adapting it to our reality. So thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thanks for having me and for allowing me to share the vision of the Ministry of Industry, Energy and Mining. Answering your question about our strategies for the future, I think it's very clear that in the case in Uruguay, we need to understand or to spend just 1 minute basically to analyze what we have done so far. I would like to talk about energy transition as a continuous process that started, you can go as far as last century, when we started using hydroelectric energy, and that was the first milestone on which we continued building experience. In 2008, between 2008 and 2017, Uruguay doubled its generation capacity, and that was 100% using non-conventional renewable energy. At the moment, we were discussing the sources to use, because of what you mentioned about these kind of energies being complementary to each other. That's part of the lessons learned in the process. At the time, we were discussing whether to use biomass, solar, or wind, and what experience showed is that the three of them were complementary, and the three had a clear advantage that was basically being complementary to the hydro energy that we were historically using. So now we have situations like the one we have. This event is taking place through 100% renewable energy. This is 45 hydro, solar, photovoltaic, and biomass. Everything is being used 100% renewable energy. And that piece of data, it's every time is getting more and more frequently used. We have a consolidated view of the use of renewable energies. As from the renewable energy sector, we would like to say that so far it's been easy because decarbonizing the electric sector was basically about using technology that was developed in the past in some other countries. And basically what we did is, thanks to the international crisis, was to bring that technology to our region. The challenge that we are facing right now, it's way more complicated. Basically because we have the transportation system sector that is not willing to change. It's very difficult to change that sector to renewable energy. So what we can see is that 40% we need to reduce that percentage because that 40% is using fossil fuels. And the way in which we can make progress in the decarbonization of this sector, of that 40%, there is not just one technology to be used, but again, we need to work on complementary aspects. And at that point, I would like to highlight that the first step taken by Uruguay was in 2007 when they passed the Agrofuels Act, where we work in biodiesel and ethanol, and I would like to highlight about that process. It's not the most successful part of our story, but for instance, in the case of biodiesel, users were not convinced about that, and as a society, we went backwards. So now it is included. It's not included anymore in the energy mix. Why? Because of economic factors, because of the economic impact it had. That is something that needs to be taken into account. How we communicate this idea and these advantages. In our case, we tried to do it. I think that it was 1.50 pesos that was added to the end user, and that was not accepted by society, and it could not be implemented. We still have, the mix of ethanol around 10%, and that is mandatory. And in the future, we would like to add other fuels. In fact, there are plans to make progress in the development of HBO or other types of renewable fuels. So I think that the first step of the transportation decarbonization was represented by biofuels. After that, and once we had made progress in the decarbonization of the electric systems, we wanted to use electric mobility associated to the increase of energy efficiency in the transportation sector. Basically, electric mobility, batteries. The issue with the batteries, we could only cover a fraction, and if you see the distribution of the fleet and emissions in Uruguay of the transportation sector, you can see that 4% of the fleet, basically heavy trucks and long-distance buses, basically they are responsible for 36% of emissions. So we needed to find an alternative to that. And because of that, then we started drafting and taking the first steps, basically, of the path. And something similar to what's happening in panel 4, that is like hydrogeneration in Uruguay. and basically to complete with the roadmap. Basically, there we have natural resources, the biology sector as an important contribution so that we can decarbonize the transportation sector.
The importance of biomass generation in Uruguay brings us a lot of availability, and the roadmap for the hydrogen roadmap goes not only through the hydro itself or the derivatives, ammonia, but the carbonized derivatives, ethanol, synthetic fuels, and the AFs mentioned by Agustin. And that's the result of when we take green hydrogen and we can combine it with biological use, we can structure hydrocarbon which are totally renewable, and they can be done biologically, so it's possible to advance in decarbonization. And that has the advantage that you're changing fuels and you're not changing the equipment or the engine, except for some adjustments. So through all those ways, you can find a decarbonization path. And again, it's important to know what we mentioned, that it's not only one technology, but it will surely be a combination of many technologies. And there are many lines that are in competition, of course. When we adopt energies, we have to be prepared to capture each of the ones that result. And it's important, and something that was said at the beginning is the role of public policies, generating the possibilities for these things to happen. The role that we need to have from the administration is to give certainty, mitigate risks, give the signals so that the private sector will have these ventures, will invest in these new ventures. So we have to play in that field. And then again, something that was said in the opening session is the existence of all the political parties. For us who work in the technical areas of the administration, the best thing that happened is this, because we have a clear roadmap now. Apart from what every administration will do, we at least know that Uruguay is headed that way, and that has been agreed. We also have the disagreements. These are parts of the agreements. But even more important than this for us is for the private sector to have this tool. And we have maintained all the commitments. And so, if we think about the case of the electricity sector, with regards to public companies, state companies, they play a very important role in order to give certainties and assume commitments and make sure that the obligations are met. And there's a part that we can play in the new challenges. There are differences. For example, when we talk about hydrogen and derivatives, clearly we won't have a PPA with the state, but we will have to, the developers will have to go and find the off-takers. But there's a whole other chapter with other topics to give certainty with regulatory matters. So with the use of natural resources, we have been just through a very particular year last year. We had a severe drought in 2023. we have here, so we have to give certainties and commitments. Also, when we talk about offshore, in the following months, we will be signing the new decrees that will start this path. Although we envision this, it will be developed and used in the long term, 2050 and onwards. Maybe they come before this year, and that would be more than welcome. But in the rest of the year, we will be communicating, we will be having some decrees approved together with ANGAB. We want to make these tenders very attractive for the private sector, and also we want to start doing the campaign measures and start to go on this path to use this offshore resource in the long term. We reached that point led by the potential demand of hydrogen at a global level. Until then, when we talked about offshore, we said we have things in the mainland. We're not going to do something more expensive offshore. But now we're talking about other size ventures. And at some point this will arrive. We will have to meet this demand also. So this would be the first thing that we are doing. And clearly, in the future, we don't see anything else but the renewable energies for the energy matrix. Uruguay doesn't have carbon, nor oil, nor natural gas, so it doesn't have the possibilities. So the most economic resources in the matrix. There have been some studies done by the University of the Republic and show a positive impact of including renewable energy with savings that can be quantified at $540 million a year. Thank you very much for your vision, for the state vision from the part of Florencia and Wilson. It's very clear now that we have complementary technologies. We've also seen that there are clear obstacles for the use of those technologies, and these are related to infrastructure. And my next question, which is for everyone, I would like to start with Silvio, is how is this infrastructure adapting to use these new technologies and new resources? Let's focus not only on the needs for the increase of capacities, but also adaptation with a climate point of view. We've seen how the climate impacts. I come from Mexico. I don't know if anybody has seen the terrible hurricane we had in Acapulco recently. The city is in ruins, and the city doesn't have energy right now. So adapting infrastructure as such, we're not only talking about reducing emissions for not using fossil fuels, We are talking about how to have an infrastructure that can continue active or overcome these climate challenges that we will have, like typhoons, tropical storms, or the rise in the level of seawater. Many times we lack natural resources, and then suddenly they come all together, and we have floods and others. And again, Silvia, I will ask you this question again. It's important to relate the last thing that Wilson said, the idea of why Uruguay is thinking about offshore because of hydrogen, with a vision of positioning Uruguay. It will have energy reserves. It will be able to sell energy, renewable energy. It could be a situation that the oil producing countries have today, like in Argentina, oil in Venezuela. How, in the future, can Uruguay have that bargaining capacity at international level? Not only Uruguay, but the region itself. How can it negotiate at a global level? Because it will have renewable energy adapted to climate change. So Silvio, the question again is, how can we adapt this for the use of these new technologies? Very well, thank you very much. I will start with saying the first part, what we discussed with the challenges that we have, the problems that we have, and having renewables, which was mentioned here, which has to do with transmission and storage. And regarding transmission, we all know that this impact on a challenge for the development of renewable energy. And I don't know if this has been taken into account, but when we talk about offshore wind, we have an advantage that our continent was built on the border. And energy, or at least we have a transmission network in the interior all the way to the border. And now we are thinking in the long term to include energy that will be in the sea. And retransmission will make our continent grow, because the infrastructure will be outside the continent, and all the development of the transmission that will connect offshore wind, it's a new development, and in the opposite sense of everything that has been already been built, which was always about bringing energy from the interior to the border, because we have the greatest load and consumption on the borders. So that's another challenge that we face. Another thing that happened in our region, as was shown in the first presentation, it's a very rich region with renewable energy. And since I started, I've always been hearing energy integration, but there's always an obstacle for this in Latin America. Today we see in Chile prices, very high prices at night, $150 mega hour and megator. So naturally, there was the need to have integration from the north of Chile and Argentina to exchange energy and make use of this difference in prices. As part of the storage, there's another vector, which for us is very important and which should have a greater role. In fact, transmission is what competes with the batteries. We are thinking of solving problems. When we think of storage, we think of solving problems related to not having enough transmission. So I want to save energy to use at another time. And these vectors of reversible plants, which are batteries, these are more long-term batteries in our countries, and our countries are quite attractive for building reversible plants of closed cycles. They use the same water to produce energy in the hours with higher costs, higher rates, and to pump water. And then if I can have a closed circle battery, I'm thinking about a battery of 3 months or 6 months of regulation. Now, analyzing your question regarding having an infrastructure, a resilient infrastructure against climate change, you talked about the hurricane in Mexico, but right now we see this happening in Itaipu. We're seeing the flow of water 10 times bigger than the normal flow of water, and it's destroying all the infrastructure for tourists at the Iguazu Falls. And of course, this has to do with the increase of the water flows. We're also working with the IDB and the government of Paraguay to develop a project for adaptation measures. And we're seeing an example of what's happening. To protect we have 2 big hydroelectric plants downstream from Isabetá. These will be affected by this climate change. This is exactly what I said, that rainfall will be greater in shorter periods of time and longer periods of drought, an increase also in the maximum and minimum in the long term. And regarding hurricanes, we have to think about local solutions to have enough backup so that these things don't happen, of the lack of energy. I don't know if the way forward is thinking about transmission grids that are resilient, or if we should think about quick recovery of retransmission. I had a discussion once with Ramon Sanz. He was the president of energy markets in a consultancy agency in Argentina, And Ramon was who convinced me that it was much cheaper than thinking of a transmission line with
S15 que
10 or 15 that would resist a level 4 hurricane. This would be of quick recomposition. Maybe in 6 hours, I could put towers that I can manage through helicopters, and in 6 hours I can recover this. I think this is a more economic line that would allow the recovery of the systems faster if there are hurricanes like the one that just occurred in Mexico. Very well, thank you. Regarding recovery, I think that it's the policy that has been led forward. In Mexico there are hurricanes also. And it's worked, yes, until now. I must admit that Mexico has been a country where the Electricity Commission, always very proud of having this very quick recovery. This has not been the case. Unfortunately, it's already been 1 week and it's still having problems. But I believe that we should think a little bit more, because there will be a time when there will be a lot of climate impacts at the same time. And that could happen in the long term. So we must also think about a complementary way for technology and solutions for all these impacts. And at the beginning, Ramon, you were talking about how offshore, or how you see this regarding hydroelectricity, because these environmental impacts could destroy or maybe only affect the hydroelectric. So what you were saying at the beginning, the distribution network, the distribution grid. What's your experience regarding how we can strengthen and make resilient? How can we make those distribution grids allow private companies to make investments? Regarding generation, the offshore facilities will have that characteristic of being large scale, and they must be able to substitute the floors of a hydroelectric grid, or that they have too much water or they don't have enough. So these will be centrals that will allow the energy in the countries. But when we talk about distribution, I would like to talk about what we are seeing in general in the region is that the distribution lines have been left aside, because the electric infrastructures need, as any other installations, as any other facilities, need updating. So they need investment. And that means that public companies must modify their rates, because it's expensive and it has to be paid. So it's easy sometimes not to raise the rates when you don't update or modernize facilities, but if you have a climate impact, you will be left without energy. So right now, we are seeing that the power systems are first power systems that allow including more renewable energy. At the same time, they are much safer and resilient. If the generation fails, then it will come from somewhere else. So distribution systems and transmission systems, but we need to invest. And investing means having to face certain costs. The renewable energy industry never has left aside the possibility of participating in investing in transmission grids, depending on where they were going to connect. But again, the problem is the obstacles, the regulation obstacles, so that co-investment can happen. And that should happen when a recovery mechanism is included. So in the end, all of this is something that costs money. And we need to have a vision to include these costs in our electricity grids. We believe that there's a differential, there's a gap of economic opportunities given the low costs of renewable energy compared to electricity. And the public policy makers should take this opportunity and establish mechanisms for investments, for establishing facilities, for strengthening grids and distribution, to make this a more virtual circle, to assure the future of the financing of these. Instead of using those differentials or economies of scale for social objectives which have nothing to do with power systems. So again, many times it's public policies or generating needs that have a political profile. On my part, just to add to this question, with climate change, what can we do different? I'll go back to what Silvio said about diversification. Not only having one solution. Let's not think that there will be a magical wand with one solution. In fact, if we look at a recent case, the connections between Argentina and Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay in recent years with the droughts, it has worked wonderfully well. And we have seen how a limited collection in capacity for transmission has helped to mitigate the peaks. So there we have a signal that works, that it works. And instead of closing to how to strengthen every country and region, I think that we should look at integration. In Chile, we can see the earthquake. We are trying to find aerogenerators to operate continuously in spite of earthquakes, for example. And sometimes if we try to find perfect solutions, sometimes we will lose good solutions that have been tried in the region, which is to complement more resources, like in the north of Chile with solar energy, which can be a backup, or the support for the rest of the region over the Patagonic wind, or the water that we have along the Paraná, I am sure that's the road that we must follow. Apart from the policies, and as we have the roadmaps of each country, we believe that in a forum like this, we must unify our vision, our national vision, the sovereignty of each country, but also of integration and development, because we complement each other and we all have many good things that we can share. And it will be the best way to face the different disasters or climate impacts of droughts or tornadoes, etc. As diversified as we can be, the best solutions we will get. We've seen some signs. For example, with CAMES, we've discussed also with SEME in Chile, and I'm sure also with UTE, we are starting to ask the centrals for more information. The demand goes up and down. So although Salao Paso is very big, I think we can do much more to understand the detail of the demands and generation, and to work with all the technology that we have on digitalization to reduce the flaws. We had blackouts in Argentina recently, and I think many of those were avoidable, at least. And then we had to review the control systems to see how we can prevent this. Those are the areas that we should discuss in forums like these. From the private sector, we see that the private sector can think beyond the borders, or can think about all of Latin America and how we can take those energy into a greater scale and to help the governments and the authorities. We have 20 minutes left. Agustin, Florencia, Wilson, same question. How is the infrastructure adapting on the demand side, on the supply side? Regarding biofuels, they use the same. There are not many challenges. There is one big challenge in the previous process to producing biofuels, which is the production of biomass. Different from all the other, like oil and gas and wind and salt, biomass has to be cultivated and taken care of. And climate change is a big challenge for agriculture, agroforestry, and unifying both worlds of agriculture and energy could be with adaptation to climate change. I'm not going to go into much detail. That would be more for an agricultural forum. But when we talk about adaptation measures to ensure the production of biomass, there are many lines, from applying biotechnology to create high water stress crops. So including different technological packages, biotechnological packages of information. In the case of bioenergy, this has to do with adaptation in the first parts of the biomass production. In Argentina, as Andres was mentioning, on March 1st, we had a case, was the burning of a field because of the drought in Argentina. Atucha was disconnected from the system, So nuclear was disconnected, the transmission line was disconnected, and that's where we can see why we must invest and why we must strengthen and why the climate change agenda cannot be delayed. Also, when we look at the rates in Argentina, there was a decision made which was being delayed, the segmentation of rates to subsidize the users who really need it and to expand subsidies, not only for a political situation, but as a need for development. And in infrastructure, as I said, it's like the transmission lines and distribution lines. If we don't have a commitment and a joint objective, we're talking about empty things. The province of Buenos Aires has more than 250 distributors of cooperatives. Uruguay has one. The region in Córdoba, which is a province, has 230 distributors. Tucumán has only one. And that gives us a diverse reality in Argentina. That's why we have to find the right allies for public policies. We work with ADERA, that brings together the cooperatives in our country to give us a solution to face the problems of financing and of commitment with maintenance. This is a pending issue for distributors. And we must ask the regulators this analysis. And as an opportunity, we must understand the integration, not only of the system, but of experiences. We must understand all the realities of our neighboring countries that will enrich our knowledge and will allow us to have a better plan and results, and understand that maybe others' solutions can be implemented in our country. Regarding what you just said of integration, we like to say that we have an interconnected region. We have physical interconnection. We can exchange. We also have the will to assist in emergency situations. We've assisted neighboring countries in the past and recently. But we haven't moved forward in optimizing this altogether. We're distributing wealth from one place to another, but others are losing maybe thermal. And we can follow this path. It just depends on political will. So we must continue to insist on this. The most important thing to say is that we must quantify the opportunities that are lost. In order to convince the economy. And going back to your question about adaptation, we always say that our actions, at least in Uruguay, have to do with mitigation and adaptation. Even though in the end, we look at this through right now, we are still having a national plan for adaptation. And then, clearly, we will see the possibility of early warnings when it goes from energy to meteorological, looking at real-time actions. Regarding what Agustin said about biomass, most of the scenarios in Uruguay show that we are seeing that it will rain more, we will have higher temperatures, and we have a whole lot of waste of biomass on the fields. So again, we can move forward with that in the primary stage, which is related to resources. We have to think about this throughout the chain.
Y después, la segunda parte de tu consulta.
And the second part of your question was about how we see the future as exporters of energy. In electricity, we already are exporters. Starting from 2013 onwards, except for some exception, we've been exporters of renewable energy. And with that capital, on that basis, we hope to look at the future, not only as exporters of energy, but we also want to export fuels. We have two components on the roadmap. One is to supply the market, and also is to export derivatives. Uruguay, South America could be like Saudi Arabia in the future when we looked at the natural resources. So that change is very important, and we must also think about this, because clearly we have the chance, but we have an experience that, when we saw this in biofuels also, it was stopped at a point because of certification issues. But certifications at international level created problems, and now we are seeing discussions on certification of green hydrogen and derivatives. As a region, we must reflect on this. Whatever results from our discussions will result. If Europe says, I want to buy a product with these characteristics, even if we try to tell them that the situation on the use of land, use of soil in Uruguay has to do with this, but many times we don't convince them. So it's an interesting time, and fortunately we see IDB and OLADE, they are working together on this. We hope to talk about what we consider is essential for certification. So that we can include a new production chain at a regional level. I have other things written down, but I don't think we have time. Does anybody have any questions in the audience?
Porque tenemos que generar y generar y generar para sostener un consumo que, si lo pensamos, es descabellado, ¿no? No va a haber forma sustentable de sostener cualquier consumo de cualquier manera, como en la civilización occidental, por lo menos la que conozco, hace. Y ese comentario nada más.
Para la agenda de la eficiencia energética.
Sí. ¿Qué tal? Juan Lujambio, estudiante de Energías Renovables de UTEC. Para el sector eólico, ¿qué desafíos o cuestiones no tiene resuelta operativa onshore que hay y necesita resolver para visualizarse en el offshore, si es que hay? Y bueno, eso por ahí, ya que estamos cortos de tiempo.
De offshore, no es una cuestión operativa, pero básicamente lo que se necesita para materializar los proyectos que hay, una enorme cartera de proyectos, especialmente en América Latina, ya digamos previstos para poder empezar a desarrollarse. Uno de los aspectos fundamentales, más allá de lo que es establecer un marco regulador que permita proporcionar certeza, sobre todo pues, a los promotores que vayan a adjudicarse determinadas áreas eólicas marinas para explorar y posteriormente explotar, probablemente el aspecto que más dificultades está generando es lo que se llama el camino al mercado, la route to market, ¿no? Es decir, de qué manera esa energía que se va a generar en los parques eólicos marinos va a llegar al mercado. Es decir, todo el camino para llegar a un off-taker, cómo se va a habilitar el acceso de esa electricidad desde el punto de vista material a los mercados, con la finalidad fundamental de poder financiar esos proyectos. Entonces, eso es un aspecto crítico que hoy por hoy, digamos, no forma parte de la agenda más caliente, vamos a decirlo, de la discusión, porque la discusión está en otros aspectos, digamos más atrás desde el punto de vista procedimental o normativo, pero este será el gran tema, vamos a decirlo así, en el futuro, porque los proyectos de energías renovables están, digamos, acostumbrados a financiarse de una forma bastante estandarizada sobre la base de contratos de suministro de electricidad en el largo plazo, y precisamente por el tamaño que tienen estos proyectos y los volúmenes de generación que conllevan, pues probablemente resulte más complejo que en otros casos financiar este tipo de proyectos a efectos de poder cerrar contratos de suministro de esta naturaleza, ¿no? No sé si esto responde a tu pregunta, pero me parecía que iba por ahí.
Y yo, de mi lado, el área más técnica, si querés, te diría que el recurso en territorio en Latinoamérica en general es muy bueno. Quizás en Europa es un poco distinto, que el viento marino es muy bueno en el Mar del Norte, sobre todo, y compite fuertemente contra sitios en tierra que tienen menos recursos. En Latinoamérica, digamos, no hay, todavía, yo no tengo información al menos de que suceda lo mismo. De hecho, no sé, en la Patagonia o en el nordeste de Brasil, un aerogenerador puede tener un factor de planta cercano al 60-65%, lo cual es prácticamente energía continua de base, ¿no? Entonces, digamos, yo creo que puede tener sentido la eólica marina, sí, más por un tema de la infraestructura, de las redes, por ejemplo, en Brasil, quizás construir más redes y más redes para llevar energía del nordeste a San Pablo, quizás tiene sentido poner marina más cerca a la costa, que todo un proceso ambiental y social de hacer líneas y líneas y líneas, ¿no? Como una idea. O en Chile, por ejemplo, si Chile pudiera tener tecnología flotante eólica, sería la gran solución que tiene hoy para acercar la generación a la demanda, ¿no? Que es el gran tema que hay en Latinoamérica, ¿no? Una gran región, una densidad de población baja respecto a quizás otras regiones, y unas distancias que son brutales, ¿no? Las líneas son siempre miles y miles de kilómetros. Entonces, son inversiones muy grandes y Y yo creo que ningún país puede arrancar de cero de vuelta. Hay que tomar lo que hay y sobre eso buscar eficiencias, mejorar, poner toda la tecnología que se tenga a disposición. Y me imagino que estas mega inversiones solo ocurrirán en lugares que realmente se puedan justificar con todas las condiciones que decía Ramón y todo el panel, ¿no? Tienen que pasar muchas cosas, en mi punto de vista, antes de que se desarrollen estos megaproyectos.
¿No? ¿Ningún comentario adicional?
No, simplemente, no sobre este tema, sino que, no tengo una respuesta para lo que planteaba Hernán, pero creo que es la gran reflexión del panel, o sea, de todo el espacio este. El asunto de cómo manejar esa insaciabilidad que tenemos por el recurso, porque nosotros lo único que hacemos es cambiar de lugar el problema, o sea, en realidad tenemos un problema energético, lo vamos a llevar a futuro una crisis de materiales para abastecerlos, la generación de los equipamientos para abastecer la demanda de energía. Y cuando esté esa, no sé dónde vamos a ubicarla, pero es lo único que hacemos, cambiar y patearla para adelante. Y de hecho, creo que es relevante el comentario, y como había quedado medio desapercibido, digo, simplemente remarcarlo porque creo que es realmente trascendente.
Sí, gracias. Yo también lo iba a retomar porque creo que es un tema importante. De hecho, justo antes del panel lo estaba comentando con unos compañeros que yo creo que no ha desaparecido del todo, pero parece que ya no es sexy, entonces ya no se habla. Creo que ahora el sexy es el tema del hidrógeno y por eso se habla tanto, no necesario, y por eso hacía yo tanto hincapié en la complementariedad, porque pareciera que ahora o es hidrógeno o es nada. No, hay miles de cosas que se pueden hacer y hay muchas inversiones probadas, y hay muchas inversiones hechas ya que se tienen que eficientar, digamos, hay muchas opciones. El hidrógeno entra como una tecnología adicional, una posibilidad adicional, pero no puede sobrepasar lo que ya se ha construido, no se puede pasar sobre lo más simple, que es apagar las luces al salir de la habitación, ¿no? Creo que eso todavía sigue, necesitamos que siga estando en el tablero, porque si no, no vamos a conseguirlo nunca. Sí, adelante Silvia.
Solo un complemento en esta línea, pensando al revés. Yo siempre pienso diferente, disculpa. Pero indo en el comentario del consumo exagerado, etcétera, y claro que ahí está eficiencia energética como el elemento de reducción del consumo. Pero por otro lado, nuestra región es una región extremadamente diferente. Tenemos pocas personas que consumen mucho y muchas personas que consumen mucho poco. Y si vamos a pensar, bien, vamos a reducir el consumo de las personas que consumen mucho para pasar a las personas que consumen poco, la ecuación no cierra. Bien, porque si yo aumento el consumo del número de personas que consumen poco, no es un programa de eficiencia energética que va a balancear esta cuenta. Y mi pensamiento social es que esta cuestión de diferencia que incluso abordamos aquí en el panel, que necesitamos pensar en las energías también en el contexto de la cuestión social, es una cuestión importante, y si vamos a caminar por una dirección más egalitaria, el consumo va a crecer bastante.
Sí, al final es una transición energética que sea justa y equitativa, y eso significa necesariamente que va a haber mayor consumo. Exactamente. Entonces, nada más ya para cerrar, me gustaría recoger lo que yo creo que son los grandes resultados. El tema precisamente que resaltaba al final Silvio, el tema de la inclusión de las comunidades, de la equidad, de la transición justa, de la cadena de valor, de lo que nos comentaba Florencia, de aprovechar lo que se tiene a nivel país para poder crear nuevos empleos, las oportunidades del litio. El tema de las redes de distribución y transmisión, creo que ese es un gran tema, ya lo han puesto sobre la mesa. También el Smart Grid, la digitalización, digamos, no solamente mantenerlas y ampliarlas, sino realmente hacer un proceso de innovación también en las redes de transmisión, que pareciera que ya está todo hecho, pero no, hay mucha capacidad de mejora en eso que puede facilitar la integración de nuevas tecnologías, de generar las condiciones a largo plazo, no solamente en política pública, como ya nos decía Wilson, sino lo que nos decía Ramón, el largo plazo empieza ahora, y empieza ahora sí en políticas públicas, pero también en seguridad para el sector privado, para las inversiones en los contratos que conlleven la seguridad de temas de mantenimiento, de innovación en toda la infraestructura, que la infraestructura tenga características también de resiliencia, de adaptación al cambio climático para que no se tengan que rehacer cada vez, sino que realmente haya una opción de que sean a largo plazo, como son las políticas. Temas de complementariedad tecnológica, que creo que ya hemos hablado mucho, pero también de integración regional. Creo que eso se lo voy a pasar como apunte a los de OLADE. Ojalá no sean en 50 años, pero creo que es importante que en vista de las necesidades, las grandes necesidades que hay en este momento y que habrá en el futuro en la región, que no se dupliquen, que se eficiente no solamente los sistemas energéticos, sino también la inversión, que se pueda realmente llevar a cabo hacerlo más eficiente. Con esta red de distribución regional, realmente una visión transfronteriza de integración energética y de la optimización del conjunto, como bien decía Wilson al final, poder pensar no solamente en las redes energéticas nacionales, sino en las redes energéticas regionales o subregionales, que nos van a permitir obviamente eficientar la inversión privada, pero también, como decíamos, atender las necesidades y las emergencias de los países vecinos pues de manera más sencilla, más fácil y más rápida. Con esto terminamos. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Seguimos en la conferencia. Muchas gracias a los panelistas.